Welcome to the Legal Innovation Forum podcast series, leading at the intersection of business, innovation, and law. I'm Lucy Saddleton, Managing Editor at the Legal Innovation Forum. Brought to you in association with DiliTrust, this episode features a panel discussion from the Legal Innovation Forum Toronto 2026 on the evolving landscape of ESG. Stay tuned to hear how legal leaders are playing a critical role in moving beyond traditional ESG frameworks to embed sustainability into business strategy and meet stakeholder and regulatory expectations.
My name is Lindsay Duprey, and I'm the president of RioCan Canada, and I'm pleased to be moderating this discussion on ESG Reimagined, where a new paradigm emerges. We're at a moment where ESG as a concept is evolving, both in how organizations talk about it and how they operationalize it. Today's conversation is really about what's changed, what's actually enduring, and what this next phase looks like in practice. I'm joined by an outstanding group of leaders here today. Thank you all for being here. Let's start with a quick round of introductions. If each of you can briefly share your role and how ESG or sustainability shows up in your work today. Maybe we'll start with you, Jennifer.
Sure. Thank you very much. My name is Jennifer Suess. I'm the Senior Vice President, General Counsel, Head of ESG and Corporate Secretary at RioCan REIT, which is one of Canada's largest publicly traded REITs. We have almost 200 properties across Canada, and ESG is firmly embedded in our strategy in every aspect of our operations and our capital allocation. And I'm very excited to be here today. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Michael Kelly. I'm the Chief Legal and Sustainability Officer at OMERS. OMERS is the Ontario Municipal Employees Retirement System, so it's a pension plan based here in Ontario that serves municipal employees, police, firefighters. It's a $145 billion fund that we invest in Canada and around the world. I'm also the Chief Sustainability Officer there, so ESG sustainability is really core in terms of how we look at our investment programs and how we try and participate in the financial ecosystem around the concepts of sustainability and ESG.
Hi everyone, my name is Jennie Baek. I'm a partner in the Capital Markets and Securities Group at McMillan, a national law firm in Canada. I specialize in investment funds and asset management, and so a lot of my work in terms of ESG has to do with how ESG is incorporated into funds, fund strategies, investment products, and then also assisting managers from either top-down investor level, looking at what they're doing from an ESG sustainability perspective, or assisting them with evaluating underlying investments. I'm also a member of my firm's ESG and sustainability group. We're kind of like a full service one-stop shop in terms of all things ESG.
Hi, I'm Rupali Patel Shah. I'm the head of legal solutions for North America for DiliTrust, one of the sponsors here today. I am also an in-house lawyer, spent 20 years in-house working in manufacturing in the public utility space. Have been involved in ESG efforts and then the compliance and reporting aspects of ESG when I was working for those companies, and now at DiliTrust, one of the things that we help companies do is track those things. But I think the reason why I'm on this panel is actually because I'm also American. And I think the big elephant in the room when we talk about ESG is what the lower 48 has done to the sustainability landscape globally, right? So I think that may be why I'm here, to be a little bit of the villain or the foil, because I think we Americans have a lot of explaining to do.
Okay, we're going to get to that.
Yeah.
We're going to get to that, for sure. Well, actually, that's a perfect segue. Maybe let's just start a little bit high level. So one could say there's been a shift in how ESG is being talked about globally. Some call it perhaps a recalibration, maybe it's fragmentation. We're seeing different terminology, different levels of disclosure, and in some cases, more cautious communication. So I'd love to hear from each of you in terms of how you're currently viewing ESG, the landscape in your organizations or sector or geography, and what feels truly different today compared to even a year ago. And we'll let you go first, Rupali.
No pressure. There's a few things that I believe that I like to kind of level set with. So one, I believe that corporations exist for the purpose of making money, and their leadership's sole responsibility is to protect that money and that money-making capability long-term for the benefit of its shareholders and owners and for the benefit of its employees. I think that's just the normal common sense recipe for longevity and success in business. So yes, we are all in the business of making money, and the way to do it is to think long-term. I don't think AI can replace humans because AI can't exist without human intervention. I think the climate crisis is real. I think that we are in a perfect storm of geopolitical upheaval, plus disruptive technology, plus accelerated climate change and climate crisis, which is all the reason why ESG is really important right now. Because the thing about it is that it's designed for sustainability. And when you're kind of going to these events, all around the US, where we all acknowledge that we have to be really crafty and really careful about how we're talking about something that just 17 months ago was tantamount, it was paramount, it was the most important thing. We had Goldman Sachs having a whole indices that was on ESG and demanding board parity and saying they weren't going to invest in corporations that didn't have board parity. Everyone talking about governance, everyone talking about process, everyone talking about environmental sustainability, and all of a sudden you're not allowed to talk about it anymore. But the reality of the world in which we live in stays the same, right? And we're all still in the business of making money. So for me, I think when you talk to people who are in the trenches, who are involved in corporate governance, or who are making the investment decisions and serving as fiduciaries for normal working class people, or you're talking to the real thinkers and the molders of how we think about reporting, how we think about compliance, how we think about governance, I don't think it's changed for any of us. I think it's gotten more complicated, sure. I think we have to find more creative ways to say science is real without offending people, for dumb reasons that I can never really understand. But I think it's now more than ever super important, right? And I'm also a lawyer, and my job is to ask hard questions. So for me, I think it's more top of mind than it's ever been before, because the risk profile just keeps getting more and more complicated. But we're all still in the business of making money.
Thank you. Jennifer, I'd love to get your perspective. Would you agree, or do you have a different perspective when looking at ESG or sustainability today versus perhaps a year ago even?
I would say that I agree with a lot of what's been said. I recently returned from the North American Summit on Sustainability, and the vast majority of people in attendance were indeed American. The vernacular has definitely changed. There's a defensive attitude in the US about practicing in this area, but what hasn't changed, as Rupali alluded to, is the good work being done behind the scenes and more creative ways, if you're tied to federal funding, to be able to convince those funds to keep flowing in light of the geopolitical tensions. For us, operating solely within Canada, but having investors in the US, Europe, and Asia, as well as obviously predominantly in Canada, it's a delicate balance in terms of how we communicate and how we formulate the strategy that we intend to execute upon. So where we've actually pivoted, I would say, is when I took over the department 6 years ago, there was definitely a heavy emphasis on climate as well as on the social piece of ESG. The social piece, I'm happy to say, has become so deeply ingrained in the culture, in our and most, I think, public companies now within Canada, that we have standalone policies and great, robust discussions at the board level and the management level that have really addressed a lot of those issues. Not to say there's not more work to be done. I'm still very proudly the executive sponsor of the Women's Network at RioCan, which looks to promote women in commercial real estate and beyond, and a vast array of other equity-oriented initiatives. But I would say actually the governance piece has become much more of a focus in the last 24 months. And that is particularly because of AI. And I know we'll get into this a little bit more later, Lindsay, but whether you're talking about how your board uses AI to review your confidential materials, which is something we've recently reviewed, or your employees are implementing AI platforms, perhaps without the knowledge of the legal department, we are evolving practice and policy in parallel. And that's always a very dangerous place to be because we don't yet know what safeguards we need to put in place since we're not totally sure how our people are using these very innovative technologies.
Great, thanks. I'd love to hear from Michael and Jennie as well, if you have a different perspective or you'd like to share anything.
Maybe I'll just add quickly. I don't think it's a different perspective, but for us, it's kind of staying the course. Like we never looked at ESG, and we've always, we call it sustainability. We have a sustainable investment committee, a sustainable investing policy. So we've always used that terminology. But if you think about it, we're the ultimate long-term investor. Our youngest member is in their teens. Our oldest member, I believe, is 108. So we're looking across these cycles. And so I agree the pendulum has shifted in terms of talking about these issues, especially in the United States. And we have a lot of activity in the United States. But for us, it was never about, a performative thing. It was about these issues actually create value or they create risk in the assets. And we've seen that play out. We have some assets where, say, energy transition has been a huge tailwind. We've had some assets where, we've had huge headwinds in terms of physical climate change and that sort of thing. So we've seen that play out in the value of assets over time. We're in a period now of intense geopolitics, competing interests around, with Canada having to build out its energy infrastructure. So, there's a lot going on in this space right now, which makes it very exciting and interesting. And then the next sort of area is defense spending and what do pension plans think about investing in defense infrastructure. So those are just some of the things that are going on for sure.
Jennie, would you like to add anything?
I think I'd only add, two things. And I agree completely with what everyone has said. But I think that, as a general, kind of taking a step back and looking at this topic, one thing that I think frames the discussion is the fact that sometimes when we're talking about it, there's so many different facets and issues and perspectives that sometimes you can, get everyone in this room together. And if you ask them, what is ESG, what's sustainability, what are you talking about, what are your concerns, the conversations that people are having could be entirely different or looking at different perspectives. And I think that, when we talk about, I think you mentioned fragmentation, and I think aside from the fact that there are different, political, geographical considerations, there's all this stuff happening in the industry. There's fragmentation in the fact that from the get-go, the conversation about ESG and sustainability is, kind of a mishmash of all these different pieces. Even, I think when I was looking at the notes, it said ESG or sustainability. Like we don't even have, the terminology isn't even consistent across the board. So I think that makes a discussion, like a coherent discussion on it, very difficult. But that's not to say that there aren't trends and threads and overarching principles that I think kind of pervade the entire topic. Mm-hmm. And I think one thing that I was thinking about is, from my perspective at least, which I recognize could be very different from a lot of other people's perspectives, is that I feel like we're in this era of like a push and a pull, where, and just to take one example, let's say, is you look at, and from Securities perspective, which is the area I practice in, you look at climate-related disclosures, and you see the securities regulators coming out a few years back and saying, okay, let's have a specific rule saying this is what you need to disclose from a public issuer perspective about climate disclosures. And then they're working on it, they're saying, okay, you know what, let's take a step back and we're going to see what's going on at an international level. Let's look at what the ISSB is doing, and then we're gonna come back. And then they come back and they say, oh, you know what, because of what's going on, politically, south of the border, we're going to pause this indefinitely. But then they say, oh, but we still think that this is at the end of the day, climate-related disclosures is something you need to disclose if it's material to your business. And so you fall back onto general principles about materiality and disclosures. So they're saying, okay, let's pull it back, but let's also push forward this general principle that everyone needs to still take into account when they're drafting their disclosures, thinking about what they're telling when they're thinking about what they're telling industry participants. And then just a few days ago, you have the US, the SEC saying, okay, well, let's put out, we're going to have a proposal to pull back our rules entirely. And then so maybe we'll see the fallout in terms of what that's going to do to the Canadian marketplace in terms of climate-related disclosures and how participants are going to deal with that. And so I see, all these, it's kind of like a push it forward, pull it back, and there's all these different,
confusing.
Well, it's actually,
to say the least, right?
I love just what you said, the push and pull, pardon me. And actually it's a good segue, because I think, part of what you're talking about is risk, you're talking about resilience, you're talking about long-term value. I think your example around the SEC is, how do you manage that risk in a volatile environment? So let's build on that and talk a little bit more about risk. So the concept of organizations balancing long-term, whether it be climate realities with immediate economic and political pressures, and that tension is perhaps becoming more pronounced. So I'd love to hear from you on how organizations are managing ESG. I'm just going to say ESG and sustainability and this and that in a more volatile and uncertain market. And love to start with you, Jennifer, and then maybe Michael, you next.
Sure, thank you. So I think that we benefit from the fact that right from the get-go, when we made climate or sustainability targets, they were designed to be flexible and to demonstrate year-over-year improvement rather than hard emission reductions in a period of time that we frankly were not certain we could accomplish. When I take a look back on the last several years, had we been the most aggressive in the industry and ripped out all of the inefficient equipment in our properties, the cost would have been roughly $90 million to replace our HVAC systems, just as one example. And we could have done that, and we could have gone to market and told our investors, this is how we're spending your trusted capital. But at the end of the day, what we decided was accretive property enhancing initiatives were the right way to go for RioCan. So back to Rupali's initial statement, our job is to steward the investment from our unit holders and to make sure that we do generate the return that many pensioners and average investors are relying upon month over month. If we are to be irresponsible in our spending, even if there is good intention behind it, then we're not fulfilling our fiduciary obligation. So we've taken a very steady hand. We've been extremely transparent in our disclosure, and we can talk more about that. But of course, as a public company, everything we say needs to be auditable. And so we need to ensure that any data we rely upon is accurate and can be verified. And so we've been extremely cautious when we've made those commitments, and we continue to demonstrate that continuous improvement that I think people have come to rely upon RioCan for, knowing they can trust us to do the right thing, but perhaps not in an aggressive time manner.
That's great.
Maybe I'll tackle this at two levels. So there's the systems level. So, we're a large portfolio. You could call us a universal owner of many, many securities. And then at the idiosyncratic level, so when we buy individual companies. So, when we set our emissions reduction targets, so we have a climate action plan, it's on our website. We have a net zero by 2050 goal, and we have 5-year interim goals. So our current goal is to reduce our emissions by 50% by 2030 from a 2019 level, and then we'll set another one for 2035. And when I was thinking about that, I'm putting my lawyer hat on, is we're fiduciaries, so each investment has to stand on its own in terms of its risk and return. So how do we set a goal like this? You don't want somebody, say, buying a wind farm at a 1% return to hit a goal. And just in talking to the legal community, the reality is that climate change, or the effects of climate change, is considered to be a non-diversifiable risk. It's a systemic risk. And so if we think about us owning a portfolio of companies over many, many years, it's in our interest to see that the systemic risk is reduced. You can call it the beta, if you will, of the investment portfolio. So that's how we get involved in various collaborative efforts to try and push for better disclosure, better data around climate. So that's all kind of at the systems level, because we're looking at the portfolio. Company by company, we sometimes own public securities, but we're more than half of our portfolio is private companies. So we may own, say, a 30% direct interest in a major energy project or power plant. We own 49% of Bruce Power, which is the largest operating nuclear power plant in the world. So how do we think about risk? It's part of our due diligence process. When you're buying an energy asset, and you're going to hold it for 25 years. It's just there's just no question about how to think about both transition risk in terms of energy transition, how fast is it happening, you know, what kind of government policies are going to be, what's the consumer demand, and also physical risks. And we're starting, unfortunately, we're starting to focus now a bit more on the physical risk, because the transition risk or the transition has been a bit slower than we might have thought. So anyway, there's risk all over the place on this, but there's also opportunity. So we kind of think of it in that way.
Maybe Rupali, just as a follow-up, do you see ESG risks being treated differently now, in the sense of more of an overarching enterprise risk versus a standalone category?
I'm not sure if there's a consistent approach to that, but what I can say is we've had a couple of examples since the change in administration early last year in the US, and I think there has a global impact on that. When you see what happened to Disney in Florida with the Don't Say Gay bill, or you think about what happened with Target and rolling back their DEI initiatives. And what I think both Jennifer and Michael are touching on is that there's some aspects in real estate and in long-term investment where you're thinking about things in terms of what's systemic versus what's more acute and what's something that's going to be more in the short term, right? And the thing that's really turned ESG conversations and planning on its head, in the US at least, has been the S. It's the social, right? Because that's the thing that's at risk of changing every 6 months or every 18 months or by tweet on some, Adderall infused 2 a.m. rant on Truth Social. Like, you just don't know what's coming, right? And public sentiment is very hard to measure, right? So you see what we did in the US, where like early on in 2020, in the summer of our discontent, all of these American companies said, okay, we're going to invest a lot in DEI. Emphasis on the S, right? We're going to really emphasize on the S. Investors want this. This is what our shareholders are telling us we have to do. We're going to do that. And the companies that did it and had dividends because of that, they didn't switch because the president switched, right? They didn't comply in advance. They just kept doing it because it was built into their long-term strategy. They have a way to account for that short-term, more volatile risk versus the systemic risk, which is really where the environmental stuff comes in my opinion. And S and G are the things we can influence. We cannot influence E. This is the planet, we all have to share it, right? But we can influence day to day how we govern ourselves and how we react to geopolitical issues. So I think the answer is more, we all understand that it's risk. I think we have to be a little bit more discerning as to how much of it is truly enterprise and how much of it is truly like societal. But at the end of the day, you have to acknowledge that it exists and you have to plan for it, just like anything else, right? And once you kind of strip away all the politics of it all, it's still just kind of common sense, right? And I think the companies that are treating it that way, they're fine, right? They're not having activist shareholder suits in Delaware like Disney got, or losing significant market share like Target did. They're just quietly going about their business. And so if you've treated it the right way to begin with, you're treating it the right way now. If you were unsteady or unsure, you're probably still floundering now. That's sort of what I see, and I think, I don't know, you're nodding along. So
I think, first of all, I think in this situation, it's easier to be an asset owner than an asset manager, because we're not really trying to sell anything to anybody. Right. Or if you're an asset manager, I think you got to worry about all your pension funds or your LPs and if you take this stand, are you offending 20% or 30% of that? So we just look at what do we believe. And so on the DEI, we believe that diverse boards or diverse executive teams that reflect the societies that they operate in are likely to make better decisions. So that's just a belief that we have. And so off we go. Now, when we go to the States, we don't go and put that in anyone's face or anything like that. So we don't need to talk about it so much. It's just part of, how we think about things. So I think it goes back to, what do you believe? What do you believe? Does it create value? Does it create opportunity? Does it create risk? And it's easier for some people than others to stick to that. That's the reality.
Mm-hmm. I think too, there are different ways of looking at DEI. So it's sort of very straightforward to think about it as quotas or targets, gender, ethnicity, etc. We took a little bit of a different approach as well. So one of the things I do when I'm not doing my day job is sit on the board of the Hospital for Sick Kids. And looking at the crisis coming out of COVID and the lack of access to healthcare for kids, particularly those stuck in emergency rooms for over 24 hours, really resonated with me. and having access to a real estate portfolio that at the time had a lot of office vacancy felt like an opportunity. And so one of the initiatives we undertook under the umbrella of the S of ESG was to increase access to healthcare for kids by coming up with a novel First in Canada partnership where the hospital could open a walk-in clinic at one of our properties and generate traffic, which is great for the REIT, drives people to our properties who spend money. It also does good in the communities where we operate, and we intentionally chose an area where we knew the children were underprivileged. They didn't have access historically to the same great resources that other neighborhoods did, and it's been tremendously successful. So I think there are a lot of ways to make a good impact and demonstrate those great corporate values that you have without making it a binary or overly political discussion, because who doesn't want to help a sick kid?
That's amazing. Okay, well, we're going to shift gears and we're going to talk about regulatory divergence and disclosure and the complexities. And I'm going to start with Jennie on this. How are you navigating growing regulatory divergence and uncertainty around ESG disclosure? And maybe speak to the concept that we talked a little bit about, fragmentation, dealing with different jurisdictions, and then we'll go to Rupali next.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great question, and touches upon the idea of risk, which is a lot of time when you're looking at obviously compliance with regulation. What are you disclosing? You're thinking about the next step. What are my risks? Am I going to get sued for this disclosure? Is there going to be a greenwashing claim under the Competition Act? Who knows? So in terms of, I think, navigating what is a very difficult environment because of all the different frameworks out there, the different takes that each jurisdiction is implementing right now. Canada is, like I said, it has a push and pull. The U.S. is doing what it's doing. Europe is, a lot more rigid, taking more of a mandatory approach. And if you are operating on a global basis, how are you navigating this? And I think that really, and I think this is one of the themes that came out of one of our pre-calls, is this idea that we're moving from kind of ideological to more of a practical, pragmatic approach. Like how do you take kind of, this proliferation of frameworks, these ideas, kind of the explosion of ESG, the focus on it, and what does that mean for your business actually? And I think that these were, some great points that my panel members brought up in terms of talking about, if you're just looking at like the short-term reactive response to a regulatory requirement, you're probably going to be increasing your risk a lot more than if you are taking kind of a long-term, thoughtful approach to looking at all of the different, your business, how these different jurisdictions or different regulatory regimes impact it, and how you're going to implement that in kind of like either a cohesive basis, a long-term basis that is very well thought out and thinks about all the different aspects, or even, let's say, looks at it within your organization, maybe a fragmented basis, right? You recognize, okay, well, this is one business line and this is what we're going to do because we operate here and there and, whatever it is. And you recognize that and take that approach versus just kind of saying, okay, well, this is one thing, let's put it here, and, let's just put an overarching policy in place for our organization, even though you haven't considered how that actually impacts each aspect of your business or each jurisdiction in which you operate. So I think that that's kind of, what we're looking at right now. And I think that it was, that phrase, what got you here won't get you, to your next goal. And I think that that's really what we're looking at, is that you're taking kind of these general principles, and then you need to take a different approach and apply them to your business in a very, practical, pragmatic way.
Okay. Well, let me maybe follow this up, and for you, Rupali, but others as well. In our pre-call, we did talk about greenwashing risk versus under-disclosure. So I feel like we need to address that here. And I guess the question is, are organizations becoming more conservative in what they disclose or just more precise?
Yes.
So Michael, do you want to
So I
take
think
that?
I think it was all well-intentioned, because nobody wants to be, there should be rules against people saying things without anything to back them up. I agree with that. The issue was you had this push to try and get more disclosure and maybe even give some safe harbors for disclosure, because this climate change is such a forward-looking topic and it's relatively nascent and all those things. But I agree, you can't just say anything. But these Competition Act provisions came out, they gave a private right of action, and they had pretty onerous requirements in terms of like the standards that you had internationally, you had to tie your claim to an international standard. So the effect was, the lawyers got involved at the various companies. They said, you know what, let's just take the disclosures down or pare them right back to the bare minimum. So it's like, that's not useful for pension plans or major institutional investors. So it had this chilling effect. They've since, they've brought it back a bit, so they've amended things like the private right of action, and I think they've been a bit more lenient on what kind of standards you can use. So they've kind of calibrated that a bit, but for a while you had this push and pull, I guess, to use that theme. And in the pension industry, so, there are some pension plans that have retired their net zero 2050 goals or their other goals on the basis that they were worried about, a claim for greenwashing. Because, even though many companies will make net zero 2050 claims, we do as well, some of the plans didn't have like interim steps or anything. So there's legal risk there. You can just say that. So, one of the plans pulled their net zero 2050 goal, but 3 months later they had they have a lawsuit, a class action lawsuit now for lack of climate ambition by young beneficiaries. So that's an interesting thing. So you at one hand, you worry about this legal risk if you put these goals out there. On the other hand, if you don't have your goals, you might get criticized for not having ambition. So I think that's kind of been an interesting thing. For us, we'd like the disclosure. We'd like a harmonized disclosure, ISSB standards, rather than fragmentation, because we're investing all over the world. And we'll ask for the disclosure if it's not mandated, and we'll hopefully get it to be able to invest. But if in a perfect world, there would be a more standardized way of disclosure, which would be easier for everyone, the disclosures and the people like reviewing the disclosure, because it would be more harmonized. But we live, what is the saying? We take the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. Yeah. Someone said that.
Well, so we have a couple more topics to cover, and I also want to get your predictions. But so why don't we move from disclosure to execution, and specifically embedding ESG into decision making. And maybe, Rupali, I will start with you. Sorry I missed you on the last one, but just to share your perspective on how organizations are embedding ESG, climate, and operational data into decision making.
I think Jennifer hit on it earlier when she said auditability, right? You have to behave as though the future auditor or regulator is going to come back and say, what did you know? When did you know it? What did you take into consideration when you made this decision, right? We are all imperfect, and that we are limited to the knowledge that's available to us at the time, right? I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't know what's going to happen 6 months from now. And so discernment and documentation, I think, are the two things, right? So be discerning in what you choose to document, but document well, because at some point someone's going to look back and ask a question, right? And I kind of think it's like, when people say when you live in interesting times in history, like live your life such that one day if your grandchildren say, what did you do, Grammy, during those difficult times? You can say with pride, I did the best that I could and it was okay, right? And I think that's the only way forward when there's this much uncertainty. But no matter how complex things are, you always owe people honesty and transparency, right? And how much investors place value in that honesty and transparency, that may change. But at the end of the day, there is value attached to that, right? So how you document things, how you as lawyers, we as lawyers in particular, we're really uniquely positioned as the memory keepers and the conscience and the heart of an enterprise. So be discerning, but document, right? Because someday somebody is going to ask you. You hope it's not a regulator, but it likely will be. But the worst is like if one of your kids asks you, like, what did you do? Why did you work for this company that did this horrible thing? You're like, well, you want to be able to say with an honest, with a straight face, I did the best that I could with the information available to me at the time. So that's what I see. I think that's maybe a little bit of a cop-out answer, right? To how to navigate so much complexity. I think you need to go to greater minds than mine, like Jennie's, to really understand the ins and outs of how to document properly. But document and discern.
I'm wondering if, Jennifer, you have a perspective around just data quality consistency, or where you are getting traction versus where you're feeling friction in kind of moving from disclosure to execution?
Sure, and I'll go back to your last question, Lindsay, because I think it ties in really well, which is how do you embed this kind of thinking across the organization? And I think the answer is most of our teams are quite lean. So I work in an organization of over 500 employees. The ESG team specifically has 3 people. So if it is to be successful, that strategy has to become embedded in the operations of the business. When we do our offsites, for example, and we look at our capital expenditure budget, or we look at our governance, those topics of discussion now are deeply part of what we're talking about at the table. So if we are going to spend money replacing rooftops, are they going to be solar paneling? If we're going to enhance our parking lots because they're in need of repair, can we take that opportunity to install EV charging stations? So that's one way of getting the conversation started. Another way, frankly, as we move through the AI era, and we've barely just begun, is thinking about more practically how you can be a great lawyer. So I've said before, I think a good lawyer mitigates risk. I think a great lawyer adds value. And so when you think about how you add value to your organization, one thing that's come up recently at RioCan is historically the IT department were the people you called if your computer didn't work. But that has changed. They're now really the focus of what is quickly becoming a technology-based real estate company. Do we have the right people in those positions to do that remains to be seen. But one thing that I've identified already is that a lot of the practices they were engaging in, like cyber testing, seeing where our vulnerabilities are, those things historically were done as projects through the IT department, and no longer should they be. If you put them through the legal department, the findings can now be privileged, and that becomes very important when vulnerabilities are identified that can subsequently be used in lawsuits and disclosure. So it's a little bit of a roundabout way of answering your question, Lindsay, but I think the practical approach is to really take a hard look at your organization, whatever your business is, and take the things like sustainability initiatives, like governance, like social-based enhancements, and see how you can make people believe that these things are accretive to the business you run.
That's great, thank you. So we cannot have a discussion without mentioning AI, and that was a great segue, Jennifer, and I wanted to turn it over to Jennie, and sort of talking more broadly about infrastructure, sustainability pressures, and this onset of AI. And Jennie, for you, what new pressures are emerging at the intersection of AI and infrastructure and sustainability? What are you seeing?
Yeah, I think that, and maybe this is a bit of a cop-out answer, but I think that in the same way that AI is transformative across all businesses and all industries and just your day-to-day life, I think that it is also transformative when you're talking about ESG and sustainability, and obviously connected to that is the infrastructure, which I think can mean so many things in terms of the infrastructure that you need to implement AI in those areas or even in your business. And I think that maybe there's, I guess 2 things that I'll just point out, and then I know we're short on time, so okay. I'll be very quick.
We're going to go to Michael
next
too.
I think that the 2 things I'm going to point out is that AI, I think when you're talking about it from an ESG, I was thinking about it, I'm like, really AI hits E, S, and G, and everything in between. Like it just permeates almost every single aspect of ESG. And I think the other thing that I think that maybe we'll see from a practical perspective is that, you're looking at fragmentation, like all these different inconsistencies in terms of information reporting, et cetera. And I think that AI is going to be a really practical tool to kind of weed through that because of its ability to kind of, get through data and summarize it and, really kind of create efficiencies in that regard.
Great, thanks. Go ahead, Michael.
Maybe here's another angle. These, I think everybody knows this, these data centers consume an enormous amount of power. So this is kind of fascinating because, every time you do a ChatGPT or whatever, that requires energy to cool all these big data centers. And so the grid, so the grid capacity has become a huge issue. And so the grids need to be built out. They need to be doubled. But so the interesting thing is, so that sounds like it's a negative in terms of emissions, et cetera, because power takes emissions. But if you There's also an opportunity to build it out. So I heard some stat that even in the United States, even now, 90% of new electricity grid expansion is being done by renewables. Even to set up a gas plant, there's like a 10-year waiting period or something for gas turbines. So maybe we're inadvertently building out the next generation of a new power grid because the people that need it, the hyperscalers, they are willing to buy kind of renewable or specifically purchase renewable energy solutions. So in some ways, it's this concern about all the power it's draining. In some ways, it's an opportunity to build out a whole new power grid for the next 50 years. And Jensen Huang of NVIDIA was talking about this the other day, that you've got all these customers that want to buy this power, and they want to buy renewable power, whether it's renewables, nuclear, or however, hydroelectric, whatever is available. So that could be an interesting thing to watch too going forward.
Great. Okay, we're going to go into a very quick lightning round. And we'll just start with you, Jennifer, but just very quickly, in your opinion, what does the future of ESG look like, and whether you want to look out a year, 2 years, 3 years?
Well, I would never predict what's going to happen in this crazy world, but what I will say is that I think if you take the time to integrate whatever your strategy is appropriately for your organization, don't go too fast, understand what you're doing, make sure your people are trained, make sure you communicate well, then you'll be well positioned for whatever challenges await you.
And I think, again, it's a really dynamic time. It can be a bit scary because the transition isn't happening as fast as people maybe when they signed the Paris Agreement thought it would. So that is, the reality is the climate change is not waiting for people, it's happening. And so you either have an orderly transition or you have a disorderly transition down the road. So I do worry about, kicking the can down the road for future generations. But having said that, there is a lot of things happening in the, in the underbelly of the energy transition, and there's politics up here. So that gives me some optimism, but we can't keep kicking everything down the road.
Okay. Jennie, any thoughts?
I guess I'll say I couldn't predict what's going to happen, but I hope that in terms of, it might be a lot of up and down, but in terms of where we're going to be, in the long term, we're going to get to some, a good place where there is not so much fragmentation, not so much uncertainty, and there is, I guess a more cohesive view that people can kind of use to protect the environment and, meet the goals that we have.
Okay, Rupali.
It's here to stay. It's messy, it's complicated, it's hard to predict, but we've already been doing it. We called it something different before, right? And I will say, I was in business school when Enron happened. What happened after that? Sarbanes-Oxley, all of this compliance. It was messy, it was complicated. There was probably a version of us in 1999 that was having the same kind of panel, right? And then in 2001, they were definitely saying like, oh my God, we need this. So we're in the business of making money. The way you make money is managing risk. These risks aren't going away. We'll be talking about it every year, I think.
Mm-hmm. We might say it's not disappearing, it's evolving.
Yeah.
In real time,
yeah.
As we sit here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you. This has been a very thoughtful and practical discussion. So thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for listening, and please stay tuned for the next episode.